The discipline of scholars, inventors, and warriors. They make the biggest imprint on history. When searching for the meaning of discipline, it is important to examine history's value. History's value depends on the interpretation of what parts of the story that a person thinks is important. Things important at one point in time become unimportant at another point in time. Take, for example, textbooks. Textbooks from the 1980s wouldn't have the same value to civilization that a 2020 textbook would have. Imagine a school that still had history books that addressed space travel as being possible one day. And now imagine having an updated history book that addresses not only space travel, but also the rise of the internet. Those who had the history books I first mentioned as their only source of information would be limited in their intellectual pursuits compared with those who had a modern textbook. The point I'm getting at is that intellectual pursuit is determined by one's surrounding environment. When reading In American Color, Race in the Atlantic World, 1700 and 1900, I think of the differences between the leaders that established New Orleans for what it is now as compared with the workers. The French workers, the French brothers, Louis Dolio and Jean Francis, had different knowledge as compared to the workers they used to build New Orleans. We see the value also in the works of Bolingbroke. And I'll use this example again. The discipline of oracles proved grossly ineffective because Codrus and Deci were killed regardless. The oracle had a different value for history than Deci and Codrus. Why would this be in your rationale? Why would this be in your rationale? Codrus and Deci thought that counsel of the oracle was valuable enough to grant them a victory. Thus her value was great, yet the value of the warrior's knowledge was more realistic. Chapter 1 of An American Color, A Race in the Atlantic World, 1700 to 1900, starts off with the brothers' discipline being carpentry. The value of their discipline was to establish by building the city of New Orleans. Discipline, I think, is the act of pursuing credentials for private and public use. A discipline in the reading of An American Color, Race in the Atlantic World describes the acts of both the French settlers in New Orleans and the workers they used to build the city of New Orleans. Wegman, page 10. First, I will examine how people use discipline to impose their laws over people of color, especially those of African descent. I'll do this by examining philosophies and science. The book that I'm reading from is An American Color, Race and Identity in New Orleans and the Atlantic World. Race in the Atlantic World, 1700 to 1900. While doing this, my hope is for you to gather and do research of how, regardless of all these hardships created by these laws, the colored people of New Orleans carved their own niche and established what makes New Orleans such a great city as it is today. One thing we have to consider here is that at the time, women of African descent would often sleep with white or European men to get themselves in a higher class system. And we find this as was the case with the Louis Dolio. he had children with a colored woman, and these gained them some fitting in the caste system, as I said before. Some of the philosophies I want to examine at this time. In 1721, when Africans arrived to New Orleans, they were seen as savages. Wegman addresses one of the theories by German anatomist John Mackle, in which he said their brains were blue and bluish, which proclaimed blacks to have delayed cognitive function. Wegman 17. So, of course, the disciplines of leaders took this into effect to rationalize why they would have to rule over a group of people. And then they manipulated the Bible by taking the story from Genesis of Ham. And how it goes is Ham was one of Noah's sons. He witnessed his drunken father uncovered in his tent. When Noah comes to the other sons, Shem and Japheth, tells him of Ham's indiscretion and sinful vision. Angrily, Noah cast on him a curse that subjects his children and their children after them to live as the servants of servants for all the people of earth. Wegman, page 20. And of course, what followed was they took this curse of Ham as a valid explanation of skin color. And they took the curse a step further than simply skin pigmentation. According to Abbe Jean-Baptiste Dubois, an early anatomist, the curse of Ham, he considered, since they were sun-soaked in the climate of Africa, set in physiological transformation within the African body. If Noah's curse made Ethiopians dark, the air and the sun of Africa forced the darkness into their blood, affecting both the physical nature of their organs and their mental and physical temperaments. In 1719, Dubois wrote that two men have color that is so different as to make them dissimilar on the exterior. Will have them even being limited in their minds. Wegman, page 20. Other philosophers agreed with Dubois' theory, and they found that since the Africans had black skin and wool hair and primitive cranial structures that resulted from degeneration brought on by the heat and sun, the darker skin made them become just seen as inferior. They went on to explain the four vital internal fluids, blood, phlegm, and yellow bile and black bile, made them this way. Once again, this discipline became the law in the Norcodes, which I will explain. And this placed blacks and Indians in different categories. The more I read of Dr. Wegman, I am wondering if leaders use philosophies and science to justify their abuse and discrimination. I mean, in simple terms, if it was in the Bible, it had to be right. And we'll see that as the case many times today. People will take a religious scripture and interpret it to have it give them a meaning that they will use in their personal philosophy and justify the things they do in life. And of course, there was a Dutch geographer who believed that they had a tenacious and aggressive trait, and it would not disappear from humanity if they were moved to a cooler and wetter climate. But something interesting happened. Once again, as I stated earlier, when women of color had sex with the white Europeans, it created something that they wanted to address as racial bleaching, in which they considered them hybrid animals. They gave them a little bit more credit because they were somewhat of white heritage, but they were still limited in what they could do. So, to stop this threat even further, the Code Nor Article 6 stated that white subjects of either skin were forbidden of contracting marriage with blacks, regardless of status, and the punishment they would be under heavy fines, imprisonment, or re-enslavement. Wegman, page 23. It is also important to note the meaning of two words. We have Creole, which is a blood mixture of the Europeans and the Caribbeans, which were given more rights than what was called the mulatts, or those of African and European descent. And we'll find that this name mulatto is even further made worse when the Spanish said it came from the word mule, which they considered mule, of course, to be a subspecies. But things started to turn around in 1769 with Governor O'Reilly's ordinance and instructions. It gave more freedom to those of color. Another thing we have to consider, in 1777, there were just 47 colored men for every 100 colored women in New Orleans, and what impact this had on their caste system. Of course, the Spanish had a different law system. They gave each system freedom. Orleans were able to forge a social hierarchy and independent statuses. But then again, you had other people imposing their disciplines when we had Johann Friedrich Blumenbach of Guten, led the way in declaring two races fundamentally separate in developing rather than origin. The African had dark skin and corrupt internal organs from distinct races, they claimed, but from the climate in which Africans had developed as people. As a result, these climatists insisted Africans represented the essential subspecies of the human race. Under Jefferson, they could vote, they could not vote, along with women, children, and many propertyless white men. But the Creoles of color and other African-descended people could still own property, carry guns with relative freedom, and represent themselves in court. These are some of the laws that were created from the disciplines of philosophies and sciences to impose their freedoms on the colored people. First, let's look at where the North started from. It started from a minister of Louis XIV, from someone named Jean Baptiste Colbert. First off, It prohibited slaves from owning property and stated that they had no legal capacity. It also governed their marriages, their burials, their punishments, and the conditions that they had to meet in order to gain their freedom. But religion wasn't always a bad thing. As we'll see, there was the Catholic Church tried to make private schools for colored people, free and enslaved, but the state considered these religious institutions and those affiliated with them neither public nor private, and thus they were outside the law. Wegman, page 107. By the law, Negroes and free men of color fundamentally debarred them from full citizenship, but through social definitions of class and complexion, they forced the nation's hand. They started to get some leeway. And law declared if an alien could live alongside a natural-born citizen within the bounds of the law in the territory for a certain number of years, he could show that his allegiance to the new state was not fleeting or corrupt. Wegman, pages 65 and 68. And what happened after this was communities were created, and thus we saw many of the Dolio's mark on the city of New Orleans. To examine the differences between the Spanish and the French system, the Spanish introduced more courts and judges than the single courts of France. And their codes, and the French, their codes were based on Roman law. This comes after law. So, chapter 1 opens up talking about two brothers that came to the city of New Orleans. Louis Dolio and Jean Francis. They had discipline of construction, and like many others, they came to a new area to try to make a niche in their own. Although they would do so, I'm not sure if it was done in the way that they would have intended, as Louis had slaves, and therefore his offspring weren't considered as higher of a class as the Europeans, but they were still a step ahead, given that they had white blood. And you can see this throughout New Orleans. If you study its history, you'll see that there's structures of houses based on Dolio. And besides all the hardships of the law, Dolio would make a stand against the French, gathering a militia in front of St. Louis's Cathedral in 1801. This gave him even more of a standing in the community. This reference comes from Wegman 32. To put it specifically and from the text, Jean-Louis Dolio stood between two worlds. The eldest child of, this was one of the ancestors. He was the oldest child of Malatrice, Genevieve Dolio, and Louis Dolio. A white man, Jean-Louis spent his entire life working alongside his brother Joseph, a builder and architect. They shared many of the same friends, business partners, and contacts in the white in colored communities. They accumulated a sizable fortune, both together and separately. So what had to happen was the Dolial ancestors and other prominent leaders back in the day, they had to establish their own discipline, their own niche. And there were many hardships, but still they. According to Bolingbroke, history teaches us how to conduct ourselves publicly and privately. This reference is from page 356. This seems logical in that our discipline would be simply to have a vantage point. Very simply, I think my discipline improves by trial and error. If I choose to pursue its evolving. For example, I can perform poorly at a job and get suggestions from my supervisor and either improve my job or find a new one. Bolingbroke also believed that using history by example is imitation. When thinking of this in historical terms, one can learn from watching others and perhaps even hearing, or they could learn by being educated in a specialty. This seems to be a great disadvantage for those who don't have an education or for those who are unable to learn. Some important questions were also brought to my attention when I thought of what Bolingbroke was implying by the statement, superstition was enough at one point in time. To me, when thinking of superstition, we look at how the discipline of oracles proved grossly ineffective as it was used in the example of Codrus and Diesel being killed. Reference page 356. How is he saying history needs philosophy? With this statement on history should be studied by philosophy, I think he implies we should look for causes and effects in history. This is done so we will learn and once again evolve. What starts off as an idea to help or hurt the masses becomes an integral part of history. What contributes has philosophy made to history? And I'll end this discussion by saying there's nothing new under the sun. All of this has happened before, just different people. And this is a good way to start off with Hume's History as a Guide. In considering the fact the discipline of studying history should be done objectively, take into consideration different points of view. For instance, a point of view from someone involved in an accident will be different from the person reporting the accident. Time and time again, we see this being done on the news. Something bad happens and we see reporters interviewing other reporters for us to find out what really happened. Hume goes on to say that it's all about human nature and they're driven by common things: ambition, self-love, vanity, friendship, generosity, public spirit. And these passions, mixed in different various degrees and distributed through society, have been from the beginning of the world and still are the source of all actions and enterprises. Hume 359. With this and the discipline of history, it's faulty due to the fact it produces the same cause and effect. Somebody gets mad, somebody wants to take over territory, they go to war. Somebody wants to rule over other people, they use their beliefs and get other powerful people to enact these beliefs to put people in a caste system. And this seems like an obvious evolvement from what was emphasized by Bolingbroke's criticism of the old disciplines that revolved around superstition. Hume goes on to compare his thoughts to what I interpreted as knowing the basics of how plants grow. He goes on to criticize older philosophers, Aristotle and Hippocrates, Plautus and Tacitus, that he believes were limited in their discipline of history. In the passage, should a traveler returning home from a far country, this brings us an account of man wholly and it's totally different from any with whom we were ever acquainted. These men, he put, were entirely divested in avarice, ambition, and revenge. They knew no pleasure but friendship, generosity, and public spirit. We should immediately, from those circumstances, detect that it's a lie. And we should prove him a liar just to see it objectively, see the true meaning of what's going on. Hume 360. In this, I think he is expressing why we should hear the stories of others when their point of view is predictable. Also on this thought, I think that there is room to accept others' points of view. This is supported by him saying, experiment which we could from this kind of irregular and anomalous, if it were impossible to collect any general observations concerning mankind, and no experience, however accurately digested by reflection, would ever serve to any purpose. Hume 360. It is unclear to me what Hume suggests about how we learn from history, other than what I deciphered earlier. And with that, I hope y'all got a lot out of this. I appreciate you for taking the time to hear me out. And think about the questions that Dr. Wigman's posed and the question that I posed. What ways do people use discipline to enact their beliefs and impose hardships on others? What is this thing of humankind thinking that it has to be above and rule over another kind of mankind? What sort of discipline is involved in that? Are people at different cognitive levels for secrecy of information, for secrecy of discipline? Should we have leaders in place to mold other people? Anyway, those are just some closing thoughts. Y'all have a good day or a good evening. God bless.